Good afternoon, Mr. Arlinghouse. Today is Tuesday, April the 20th, and we are talking World War II. By the way, Mr. Arlinghouse, did you check this out? That is a trainer, a plane that was used as a trainer for pilots during World War II. And guess who flew in it? That's right. I flew in the front cockpit, and the person who knew how to fly, fortunately, was in the back cockpit. It was probably the most exhilarating thing I've ever done in my life. But it was also very educational too, because you really find out what flying for early pilots was like. Because in this plane, you basically had four devices of control. At your feet, you had two pedals for banking, and then in the middle of your legs, you had a joystick for turning, and then you had on the dashboard, you had an airspeed indicator to tell you how fast you were going, and an altimeter to tell you how high you were, and actually five. So, and up here on your left was a lever, you know, a lever, and that lever was to adjust the richness of the fuel. So when you took off and wanted to climb, you would give it a rich, in other words, more gas in the gas oil mixture or gas oxygen mixture. And then, of course, when you're cruising to save gas, you cut that back some. And so we go up, and one of the first questions I asked him, I said, "Hey, aren't we taking parachutes?" And he said, "We don't fly that high." And pilots back then didn't fly that high. If you had some problem, by the time you got climbed out on the wing and jumped, your jump would be about 3 feet. So, in other words, a parachute wouldn't do you a whole lot of good. But like I said, it's exhilarating, and it was really. He said you didn't go up if the wind speed was more than 10 miles an hour because the wind would blow that thing around like a gnat. But I mean, it was awesome, Mr. Arlinghouse. I wish you could have been there. But anyway, I actually have some more pictures that I'm gonna put in future lessons. So let's get to this, shall we? But yeah, World War II. That's a World War II trainer, 1940 model. Um, so let's talk about Adolf Hitler and the biggest mistake he made of the entire war, which of course was to attack Russia, which we have to go over very fast because once again, AP Euro doesn't care about it. So Hitler had always had it in his mind to invade and conquer Russia, to gain Russia, the Soviet Union. I should write Soviet Union, Mr. Arlinghouse. It looks like Soviet Union, doesn't it? To gain Lebensraum for the German people. And I make this change because you know, Russia is only a part of the Soviet Union. Actually, the area that the Lebensraum included was more the Ukraine, the flat fields of the Ukraine, which those nice people from Russia are trying to get back right now. Anyway, in the midst of the Battle of Britain, which wasn't going well, particularly at the time, the Brits had been able to fight Hitler to a stalemate. The air raids that Adolf Hitler launched were so costly that Hermann Goering lost his nerve and he could not guarantee Adolf Hitler the air cover he would need for an invasion of Great Britain. And so he lost nerve concerning, conquering Britain. And you have to remember that in 1940, Adolf Hitler is still only uh, he's only the second year into the war. He knows he can lose support if bad things start happening. And so he wants to present himself as a winner. And so, got to win. He's not winning in Britain, so got to win. And where do we win next? Answer: the Soviet Union, maybe earlier than he wanted to. In the midst of the Battle of Britain, he had his generals prepare an attack for Russia. That was to take place on May the 15th, and this should be 1940. Yes. Operation Barbarossa, as it was called, had as its goal to invade and conquer Russia before the winter set in. Hitler had blundered much of the war from France to North Africa. I'm sorry, not Hitler, Mussolini. Mussolini had blundered much of the war from France to North Africa. He tried to attack Greece and got it, with very poor results. The British counterattacked in Africa and drove the Italians back. And by the way, in World War II, the Italians will replace the Russians as the bumbling fools of the war. And I mean, the Italians were, without a doubt, no matter where you looked in World War II, the Italian soldiers were the worst soldiers of the war, largely because they weren't motivated. I mean, Mussolini was like, you're going to do this, you're going to suffer all this because it's good for the country. And then, of course, Mussolini made himself rich at their expense. He didn't engender a lot of loyalty from his troops, and so throughout the war, Italian soldiers surrendered in droves. It's like they couldn't wait to surrender. Poorly equipped, poorly led, and they didn't have a lot of resiliency. So the British counterattack in Africa drove the Italians back. Hitler had to then divert his efforts into North Africa to bail out Mussolini. This guy that Hitler used to idolize, he now is helping. In the Balkans, the Germans took over Yugoslavia and Greece, but the fighting in Yugoslavia and Greece cost the timeline of Operation Barbarossa 6 weeks. The invasion of Russia then began not on May the 15th, 1940, but on June 22nd of 1940. Now, the thing of it is, it almost succeeded. Stalin was actually caught unprepared. He was caught surprised. I mean, he had signed that non aggression pact with Hitler back in 1939, but he really didn't believe it, but he thought he'd get 5 years out of it. Stalin was unprepared for the blitzkrieg that came fast, struck hard. He did not order his troops to withdraw at first. 2,000 Russian planes were destroyed on the ground. The Germans had advanced farther by November of 1940 than they had for the entire campaign. Germany was at the gates of Leningrad on the Don River, and of the 4.5 million Soviet soldiers, they lost 2.5 million and only had 700 of their original 15,000 tanks left. Moscow was panicking, and a German victory seemed imminent. Hitler, however, did not drive straight through to Moscow, which was a mistake. He focused, he established a line, by the way. Yeah, and a possibly wide front. Uh, Hitler once again, did not drive straight to Moscow, which was a mistake, because had he captured Moscow, Moscow was like the Atlanta of our current airline system. All flights go through Atlanta or Dallas, but Moscow was the train hub. Had Adolf Hitler taken Moscow, then he would have gone very far to paralyzing the country. All trains went to Moscow before they went to anywhere else. And so, he didn't know. He didn't drive to Moscow. but he focused most of his attack on the southern flank, the Leningrad. By the time he was why? Well, Leningrad was the heart of the wheat and oil Caucasus. Lots of wheat, lots of petroleum, and the name also. You see, because the name of Stalingrad was once again, yeah, Stalin. And by the way, St. Petersburg. I should write this down. St. Petersburg was at that time known as, yeah, Volgograd, which sets on the Volga River. By the time he was ready to attack Moscow, the winter had decimated German soldiers who were not dressed for the winter, prepared for it, and oh yeah, German tanks were diesel. Do you know what that has to do with the price of salt, Mr. Arlinghouse? What the tanks being diesel has to do with anything? Well, here's the thing. Diesel as a fuel has lots of advantages, but it has one big disadvantage, and that is it's very sensitive to the cold. It has a high freezing time. In fact, diesel fuel does not freeze. It turns to jelly. Yeah, it jellifies inside the fuel lines. And when the fuel freezes, you have to bleed the lines, which is a painstaking process, before you get, the fuel running through there again. And German vehicles were diesel. Yeah, it was not a good situation. And of course, once again, the German soldiers they were in their summer gear. And then came the Russian winter. You know, Russia has a continental climate. A continental climate meaning it gets really hot in the summer, but also brutally cold. I mean, Chicago cold in the winter, or Minnesota cold. That's better in the winter. Troops from Siberia then entered the fray, and the Blitzkrieg had become a war of attrition. Now, Hitler had a plan for Europe. See, now this is the kind of thing that AP Euro is more interested in. This was to be the Third Reich. First Reich had been Charlemagne, and the Second Reich, the empire of Otto von Bismarck. He had no real plan of European administration, but once again, he relied on intuition and pragmatism. He was an opportunist, see. What was not annexed directly by Adolf Hitler was, like Austria had been, was either administered by German military, like in the northern section of France, the northern occupation zone of France, or ran by a puppet government who were ran by German officials, such as Vichy France. You see, the southern part of France. Lebensraum was to be given to German. The land was to be given to Germans, and of course, the people who lived there would simply be displaced, uh, ran off, and if they resisted, they wouldn't resist very long. He drove Poles from their homes, gave their land to German. He planned to do this on an even grander scale in Russia. European Russia was to be settled by Germans. Any nation who was akin to Germans, such as the Swedes, the Swiss, the Dutch, would become absorbed into the sorry, German nation and would be purged of dissenting factions, quite brutally, of course. In part of this plan, 15,000 Ukrainian girls of favorable racial characteristics were sent to Germany to become wives for Germans. Hitler considered the plundered lands, no, the conquered lands, as full of plunder, artworks, any minerals, anything, agricultural products, particularly the Eastern European lands. The conquered lands were made to pay for their own occupation, uh, And more, the official German policy was that this did not matter. Yeah, what does that mean, pay for their own occupation? They had to pay the money that it took to station German soldiers of occupation there. The most brutal part of the Nazi regime, of course, was the Holocaust and racism. He considered Slavs Untermenschen, subhumans, creatures like beasts who did not deserve to be treated as people. In Poland, professionals and intellectuals were eliminated. You can't have smart Untermenschen. Schools and churches were closed. Marriages were limited to keep their birth rate in check. Hitler planned to make Europe Judenrein, or, once again, free of Jews. For a time, he thought of sending them, Jews, to Madagascar. Then he arrived at what is called the final solution, which meant the elimination of the Jews. The best number estimate we can get is 6 million Jews were killed, even though there's a significantly large population of the world who don't believe that happened. 6 million were killed, and only 1 million European Jews remained alive afterwards. Note that both Stalin and Mao Zedong actually killed more people outright than Adolf Hitler. In other words, I mean, not through war, but outright, uh, you know, starvation techniques, things of that nature. But Hitler's goal was the annihilation of a whole race, not just whoever happened to be there. Why did the Jews become the target? How was it possible to carry out such a vast murder? Well, Christian history has a long standing tradition of anti Semitism. That's part of it. And Germans had a Christian history. I mean, the swastika is a Christian cross. Nobody likes to admit that, but it's true. Hitler he bought into pseudoscientific racism against the Jews. Pseudoscience, meaning that, these people are inferior human beings, and by allowing them to exist, you pollute the gene pool, that there are definite character qualities in certain ethnicities that don't exist in white ethnicities. And, they went around and they believed this. They thought they were preaching good science. There was also a type of nationalism because many saw Jews as outsiders. Because a lot of the Jews were Hasidic Jews and wore the different clothes and had the curly hair, and they observed the tenets of their faith, and the Germans saw that as, of course, anti-German, who contaminated their culture. World War II was unmatched in its cruelty. I can safely say, Mr. Arlinghouse, that the worst calamity was ever to hit this planet was World War II. Yeah, the destruction, the wanton, willful destruction of human life, of property, the disruption of commerce and business, and then of course you get into the whole idea, hey, let's wipe out Jews, gypsies, you know, and other subhumans. Soviet armies conquered Poland and Germany and raped, pillaged, and deported millions in property back to the east. See, now, as it says there, note that it makes this point out. And like I said, there's a very good video, um, Mr. Arlinghouse, you should look up sometime. It's from the History Channel, and it's called After the War. The idea that after World War II, everybody just went back to their sidelines and said, "Hey, good game, guys. We'll see you later." It simply didn't happen. The German populace had to withstand. But people, I don't want to feel sorry for them. You have to remember, not all Germans were Nazis. And Soviet armies conquered Poland and Germany and raped, pillaged, and deported millions back to the Soviet Union. In fact, when this war is over, and when the Soviet Union, the Russian armies, the Red Army enters the city of Berlin, the commanding general of the Russian armies makes an announcement in Berlin that all people are commanded to keep their doors open, and that Soviet soldiers were given 3 days to take anything they wanted. And anything did not just mean property. Yes, Mr. Arlinghouse, one of the ugly truths of war, and we haven't even talked about the rape of Nanking yet because it's not European. The It is said that in war, that Mars is often accompanied by Venus. Mars is the god of war. Venus, or Aphrodite, is not the goddess of love. She's goddess of having sex. And so, if you understand that, then you understand what I'm talking about. Yes, the Soviet armies took whatever they wanted. It was said that somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000, during that 3 days, 50,000 German men and women committed suicide during those 3 days rather than face what the Soviets were dishing out. British and Americans dropped millions of tons of bomb on civilian populations. Yeah, that's another thing that people tend to forget. I love the United States of America, but I love history and the truth more. And the truth of the matter is that we've not always been the good guys. I mean, we firebombed, napalmed, not just cities in Japan, although we did a lot more in Japan, but cities in Germany. I mean, if you go to Germany today, and I used to think that Munich had not been molested in World War II. Well, I was wrong. Munich too. All German cities were laid waste. Prague in the Czech Republic was not. Krakow in Poland was not. They were lucky. But um, the German cities, and they bombed them with so much. And if you don't know what napalm is, I'm sure you do, Mr. Arlingham. Napalm, if you can wrap your head around it, would be a combination of the jelly that's in your refrigerator if that jelly were made of gasoline. Now imagine taking that jelly and dropping it from 15 feet onto a concrete floor. It would hit the ground and it would spatter and stick. And imagine now that jelly is gasoline and it ignites, which it does when it hits the ground. And those cities, there was so much fire in those cities that it actually created fire tornadoes that actually were so powerful it sucked people up into the vortex and just evaporated their bodies. The damage done by napalm was much worse than the atomic weapons did. Oh yes, and finally, the dropping of the A bomb on Japan unleashed unprecedented damage and started the nuclear age. And I love America, but you have to remember that the United States is the only country in history who has used a nuclear weapon on another human being. The only one to this date. I hope that will remain to be so, but I don't know. Once you open that box. And so, America and Japan entered the World War. America had been very pro-British from the beginning of this war, unlike World War I. America, however, might not have been in the Atlantic War if it had not been thrust into it from the Pacific. I mean, uh, Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but Roosevelt was an elected official, and the great majority of the United States was for staying in the United States. But, as you know, Pearl Harbor happened. Um, when the war started in Europe, Japan seized the opportunity to expand what it called its Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, aka Japanese Empire, into Southeast Asia. Only the United States stood in their way. After the Japanese attacked Indochina, Vietnam, the United States placed an embargo on oil sales to Japanese. The United States also froze all Japanese assets in the United States, stocks, bonds, holdings. and they also cut off oil sales, as did the British and the Dutch. A Japanese general by the name of Tojo came up with a plan to attack the United States at Pearl Harbor. Did you know, Mr. Arlinghaus, and I won't go too far with this, but did you know that the plan to attack Pearl Harbor, to follow a storm front across the Pacific, from Japan to striking distance of Hawaii, to maintain perfect radio silence, to use flag signals during the day and flashing lights at night as they went behind this storm front, and then to, of course, have the place scouted out. Pictures. They knew where every battleship, every destroyer was, through pictures supplied by tourists. And then also for the attack to come in, not from the west, which is the direction it came from, but from the east. And also on a Sunday morning, 7 o'clock, to come in over Diamond Head, come in from the east. And when the sun's coming up, Mr. Darlinghouse, the sun is at their back and in your face. And it gave the Japanese every possible advantage. Did you know, Mr. Darlinghouse, that the plan for that actually came from a textbook, a 1926 textbook, and the name of the chapter was "How to Attack an Island Naval Base." Here's the kicker, Mr. Darlinghouse. The textbook was in the curriculum of a little school called the United States Naval Academy. Yeah, the Japanese were wonderful at copying other countries and then adding their own little innovations. So, um, the United States was caught completely by surprise, which resembled the Japanese attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Next day, the United States and Britain declared war on the Japanese, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The potential of power of the United States was enormous, but in 1941, the United States was ill prepared to go to war. The army was small, poorly trained, and it was funny. See, that's the thing, Mr. Darlinghouse, and I only found this out by watching multiple videos. Um, did you know that every time up until the Korean War, after every war, the United States slashes its military. They sell everything. They send all the soldiers home, and the army becomes a skeleton. And so the United States had just been involved in World War One. They had millions of soldiers under arms. They had tons of equipment. And then when World War One was over with, they sold it off. In fact, I mean, during the 30s, the United States military would train with fake weapons. For example, wooden guns, wooden small arms, wooden machine guns, mortars that were nothing more than pipes. And then for the mortar itself, they would drop a can of soup into the pipe and go through all the motions and all that stuff. In fact, I watched one training film which showed a group of American tanks attacking across an open field. And you look at that line of tanks, tank here, and then this next vehicle would be a truck. And on the side of the truck would be a big sign that said tank. Another tank, truck, big sign said, it was, incredibly underwhelming. And they were going to go into war against the Nazis and the Japanese, the Japanese had already been at war in China for nearly 10 years. Yeah, the U.S. was not prepared, and the army was small and poorly trained. The Japanese quickly captured Guam, Wake Island, the Philippine Islands. I never can spell Philippines right. Take that away. That. Yes. And the Philippine Islands, as well as attacking Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, and Singapore, the all-important island of Singapore, which we won't talk about that campaign, but it was truly, if you know anything about Singapore, it's a little tiny island naval base at the end of the Malay Peninsula. And the British defended it well from an attack from the sea. But the Japanese actually cut through the jungle of the Malay Peninsula, something that the British thought nobody could do. Nobody could bring equipment down the Malay Peninsula. And the Japanese did it. And the British basically surrendered. All their guns were pointing out to sea. They were useless. The British Navy just simply sailed away. And lots of British civilians were put in Japanese POW camps. It was not a good situation. The Japanese, had conquered most of the Pacific, and it seemed that they were ready to conquer Australia, and it seemed as if nothing could stop them. The Germans had reached deep into Russia, reaching almost to the Caspian Sea, had taken most of North Africa. German submarines were choking British shipping, and on every front, the Axis were winning. In the spring of 1942, a Japanese invasion fleet was stopped at the Coral Sea, and later in June at Midway Island, which was the turning point of the war. Yeah, the island Midway. I might talk about that one day. I have a couple of good stories to tell about Midway. Number one, Midway Island. The Battle of Midway, as you know, Mr. Arlinghouse, was the first battle where the two contesting navies never saw each other. Yeah, the two fleets never came in contact with each other. As all the fighting was done by aircraft. But here's the other thing. Yeah, the other thing was the Battle of Midway was the inspiration for the Milton Bradley game Battleship. They should have called that game Aircraft Carrier because it's the same thing. What do you do in Battleship? Each of you sit behind a board. You can't see the other guy, and you put your ships all over, and you call out coordinates. And you take turns calling out coordinates. And basically, that's what the Japanese and the Americans were doing. Each one were searching for the location of the other's fleet, of the other's aircraft carrier. That's all they wanted to find, the aircraft carriers. Because, the aircraft carriers, if you could sink them, then all those planes would have nowhere to land. And sooner or later, they'd have to ditch. And yeah, it's Battleship. And that's what inspired the game, which they should have called aircraft carrier, but it doesn't sound quite as, hip, deaf, and jamming. Yeah. All right, back to the matter at hand. So, more than 20 nations all over the world were opposed to the Axis, but the major combatants were the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. There was great cooperation between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, but also suspicion, as you might guess. The Russians accepted all aid they could get, but they did not trust their allies, and they kept demanding that the British and the Americans open up a second front. Because, to be honest, yeah, the Russians were stalemating the Germans, but the Russians were paying dearly for it. Dearly. And, the Russians also were very suspicious of the West because, the West, remember, right after the Russian Revolution, the West had tried to destroy the communist government of the Soviet Union. And so the Russians were not trusting of the West, and neither the West trusting of the Russians. In 1942, the United States was not sufficiently prepared to launch an invasion of Europe. In November, Allied forces landed in French North Africa. The British had begun to drive from Egypt westward across North Africa. The Allies, with the crushing, how much more am I going to go? Yeah, to there. The Allies, with the crushing of the Germans in North Africa, now controlled the Mediterranean and were ready to attack southern Europe. In July and August of 1943, the Allies took the island of Sicily, and Mussolini was driven from power But now Italy was now defended with German soldiers. Like I said, Adolf Hitler probably wishes he had never met the guy, meaning Mussolini. The Allies landed in Italy, and the Italian new government leader, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, the leader of the government, went over to the Allies. Yes. The Germans in Italy took their power from other fronts to fight the Americans. Americans. The Russian campaign saw the most bitter fighting of the war. Now that's true. The Russian campaign, nowhere in the rest of the war was the fighting any worse, any more bitter than on the Eastern Front. In fact, for a German soldier, or an Axis soldier who was guarding a concentration camp, and if he was found to be collaborating with the inhabitants of those concentration camps, for example, having sex with Jewish women, which those women they were starving, would gladly exchange that for food and some kind of favor. Any German soldier that was found to be participating in that was sent to the Eastern Front, sent to Stalingrad. When the spring returned, the Germans went back on the offensive, but could only make progress in southern Russia. The Battle of Stalingrad saw an entire German army, the Sixth Army, the German Sixth Army, destroyed because Hitler would not let them retreat. They were surrounded and they were not allowed to retreat. Stalingrad will mark the turning point of the Russian campaign. The Americans continued to send more and more aid to the Russians. The Russians produced more and more material of their own. One of the genius things Stalin had done was that when the attack first began, Stalin packed up all of their factories for making tanks and planes, shipped them across the Ural Mountains out of German bombing range, and then rebuilt the factories, and they produced material of their own east of the Urals. The Russian army got stronger, and the German army dwindled. Going back to Stalingrad, pardon me, going back to Stalingrad, it is worth noting, Mr. Arlinghouse, that the German Sixth Army under General Paulus occupied Stalingrad. He was not allowed to retreat. Eventually, though, and I mean, the fighting was just terribly bitter. There were the fighting in Stalingrad, the Germans called it Rattenkrieg, which means rat war. The fighting was not street to street. It was not house to house. In Stalingrad, it was room to room. The Russians themselves were equally determined. What the Russians would often do is they didn't have enough equipment. They would give one soldier a rifle that had shells in it, had ammunition. The next soldier got a gun clip, nothing but a clip of bullets. And he was told to follow the soldier in front of him. And when that soldier gets shot, pick up his gun and push on. And if they were running into machine gun fire and decided they wanted to run, there were other Russian units behind them that would shoot them down. And so, yeah, oftentimes the bodies piled up so high in front of machine guns, they had to be moved. But yeah, the fighting in Stalingrad was room to room, not house to house or street to street. The United States, which was the only country with an unbombed industrial heart, now that was critical. Critical advantage for the Allies. They had, they could receive more and more material that, was not molested by being bombed, came into full production. New technology and tactics made submarines less and less dangerous to shipping. The Americans and British also began massive bombings by night. The British bombed at night, the Americans bombed by day. And the bombing by day was more accurate, but man, it was very costly. The United States 8th Army Air Corps, the B-17s, Yeah, the American B-17s, the people who flew them called them flying coffins, because that's how, they were slow. They were very slow moving and easy pickings for German fighters. And they flew in the daytime when they could be seen. And they did that to be more precise in their bombing, but they paid a heavy toll. Did you know, Mr. Arlinghouse, that the United States 8th Army Air Corps, the B-17s that would take off in England and fly largely unescorted all into their mission, lost more men than the entire United States Marine Corps lost in all of the Pacific? I mean, think about that for a minute. In all of the Pacific theater of the war. I mean, yeah. So, um, the British used area bombing, meaning that, here's a wide area, just drop, aimed at destroying the morale of the German people. Neither kind of bombing had much effect until the Americans introduced the P-51. Yeah, the Tuskegee Airmen, the P-51s that could actually fly escort to those B-17s all the way to Germany and all the way back, and could get through to bomb during the day. By 1945, the British and Americans could virtually bomb the air over Germany without opposition. The Germans had, they were out of airplanes. Concentrated attacks on industrial targets did shorten the war. Aerial bombings did take a heavy toll on the German Air Force and diverted vital German resources away from other military purposes. Okay, we will pick up there tomorrow, Mr. Arlinghouse, okay? With Roman numeral 17. So I am going to shut down. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.